I never told anyone what I found sealed inside my grandmother's writing desk until now. It was March 6 weeks after my father's funeral, and I was standing alone in the east wing of Ashgrove Manor with a crowbar in my hand and sawdust on my sleeves because as far as my family was concerned, I didn't deserve to be standing there at all. My name is Nora Whitfield. I'm an architect. For 11 years, I designed other people's houses, additions, renovations, the occasional barn conversion for people with more money than vision. And for all of those years, I never once imagined I'd be doing this kind of work on my own family's house. But my father, Edmund Whitfield, had asked me to restore Ashgrove 18 months before he died, back when the cancer was still something we were fighting instead of something we were surviving through. He wanted the old library reopened, the water damage in the East Wing repaired, the family portraits reframed. He wanted, he said, to see the house whole again before I stopped being able to see anything at all. I did it because he asked. I didn't do it for money. And I didn't do it for the house. I did it because he was my father and he was dying, and some part of me thought that if I built something for him, it would slow the losing of him down. It didn't. Nothing does. What I didn't expect was that 8 days after we buried him at the reading of the will, my half-brother Callum would stand up from his chair so fast it scraped a groove into the hardwood floor, point at me across the lawyer's desk and say in front of his sister and the lawyer and God and everyone, she talked him into this. She was alone with him every single day for a year. Of course he left her the house. The house. Ashgrove Manor, the estate that had belonged to the Whitfield family for 4 generations, left entirely to me, not split, not shared entirely to me, while Callum and Priya, my father's children from his second marriage, received the investment accounts and the townhouse in the city. On paper, it looked even. In the room, it didn't feel even at all. It felt like a verdict. You spent a year alone with a dying man, and you walked out with the one thing none of us can ever get back. Priya said quietly, not even looking at me. And that was worse than Callum shouting. Quiet accusations have a way of settling into your chest and staying there. I want to say I defended myself well. I didn't. I sat there with my hands flat on my knees and I said I didn't ask him for any of this, and nobody believed me, because why would they? I was the daughter who'd spent 300 some days measuring water damage and choosing paint colors with a man who was dying. And they were the children who'd visited on holidays and called on Sundays and now had to watch me inherit the one thing that actually meant something. From where they were sitting, of course. It looked like I'd worked him. From where I was sitting, I'd just lost my father and gained a house full of grief and a family that stopped speaking to me on the same afternoon. For 6 weeks after that, my phone didn't ring. Not from Callum, not from Priya, not from the cousins who used to send birthday texts. I went back to Ashgrove alone because the renovation was unfinished and because, honestly, I didn't know what else to do with myself. Grief needs somewhere to go. Mine went into stripping wallpaper and replacing rotted floor joists in a house that half my family now believed I'd stolen. I want to tell you what those 6 weeks actually looked like, because my phone didn't ring, makes it sound tidier than it was. The first week, I kept the ringer on loud, on purpose, and carried my phone from room to room like it might do something if I gave it enough of a chance. It didn't. By the second week, I'd stopped doing that. By the third, I'd started talking to the house instead. Not out loud, not really, just narrating what I was doing to nobody in particular. The way you might narrate a job site to a client who wasn't there. This beam's rotted through, I'm sistering a new one alongside it. This plaster's beyond saving. It's coming down to the laugh. It filled the silence better than actual silence did. I ate dinner standing up at the kitchen counter most nights because sitting down at the long dining table alone felt like something I wasn't ready to do yet. That table sat 12, and for most of my childhood it had never once had fewer than 6 people around it, and eating there by myself felt less like a meal and more like an admission of something. I slept in my childhood bedroom instead of any of the nicer guest rooms because it was the one room in that enormous house that had never belonged to anyone but me, and nobody could accuse me of taking it. I did call Priya once in the 4th week. She let it ring through to voicemail, and I didn't leave a message because everything I could think to say sounded like an argument I hadn't been invited to have yet. I texted Callum a photograph of the restored library shelving, thinking maybe if I showed him the work instead of trying to explain myself, something might land differently. He left it unread for 2 days and then didn't respond to it at all. I understood even then that this wasn't cruelty exactly. It was 6 weeks of them needing somewhere to put a grief that didn't have anywhere else to go either, and I was the only shape in the room they could set it down on. By the 5th week, I'd started keeping a running list taped inside a kitchen cabinet of everything in the house that still needed fixing, mostly because crossing things off it was the only proof I had that time was still moving forward at all. The library panel was near the bottom of that list, water-stained paneling east wall behind desk replace or repair, written in my own handwriting 3 months earlier, back when my father was still alive to ask me for it. That's how I ended up in the library that March morning, prying loose a water-stained panel behind what used to be my grandmother Eleanor's writing desk, the desk that had sat in that room untouched since she died. 22 years before my father did, the panel had swollen with damp and needed to come out regardless of anything I might find behind it. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't hunting for secrets. I was doing my job. The panel came away with a crack, and behind it was a shallow cavity built into the wall itself. Not a hiding place a careless person would stumble into, but a deliberate one, built by someone who understood exactly where the studs were. Inside it was a metal box, the kind you'd once buy to keep important documents safe from fire, and inside that box was a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and underneath the letters wrapped in a handkerchief. A small handheld recorder, the kind my father had used for dictating notes back before phones did everything. I sat down on the dusty floor of that library with my father's dictation recorder in my lap, and I didn't move for a long time. The letters were from my grandmother Eleanor to my father, written across a span of maybe 15 years, back when my father was younger than I am now. I want to be careful here, because reading someone's private letters after they're both gone feels like a kind of trespass, even when they're addressed in the last one, directly to you. But I read them because I needed to understand what my own father had wanted badly enough to build a hidden compartment behind his mother's desk for. The early letters were ordinary, a mother writing to her adult son about the garden, about her health, about which of the tenant cottages needed new roofs. But the later ones were different. In them, Eleanor wrote about the year Edmund's second wife, Callum and Priya's mother, a woman named Susan, who I'd never really known. Since she left when I was small, had quietly begun negotiations to sell off the northern acreage of Ashgrove to a development company without telling my father while he was traveling for work. Eleanor had found the survey stakes in the field herself. She'd stopped the sale using money and leverage she never told my father the full truth about, because in her words, I did not want him to know how close he came to losing his family's ground to a woman who saw it only as a number. She never told him. She carried it alone for years, because she loved him more than she wanted him to know how badly he'd been deceived. If you've ever carried a secret to protect someone you love, even one that cost you something to carry, you already understand exactly why I couldn't stop reading. And if a story like this is finding you tonight, it might be worth staying a little longer, because it only gets more complicated from here, and I'd rather you hear the whole thing than half of it. Subscribe if stories like this are the kind you come back for. I've got more of them waiting, and none of them will feel like this one. The last letter in the bundle was written the year Eleanor died, and it was addressed not to Edmund at all, but to whoever restores this room. She seemed to have known, even then, that the house would eventually need real repair, and that whoever did that repair would likely be the one to find what she'd hidden. In that letter, she asked her son, and by extension, whoever came after him, to make sure Ashgrove stayed with someone who understood it as a responsibility and not an asset. She didn't name a name. She couldn't have. She died before Callum or Priya, or even I, was born. But my father had clearly read that letter at some point in the years after her death, and he had clearly understood exactly what she meant by it. The recorder took longer for me to work up the nerve to play. The batteries had corroded slightly, and I had to replace them with a set from the hardware drawer in the estate's old workshop before it would even turn on. When it finally did, my father's voice filled that dusty library for the first time in 6 weeks, and I sat on the floor and cried. The way I hadn't let myself cry at the funeral, because at the funeral there had been people watching. The recording wasn't long, maybe 4 minutes. It was my father, clearly recording it for his lawyer, months before he died, laying out in his own words exactly why he was leaving Ashgrove to me and not to Callum or Priya. He said he loved all 3 of us the same. He said this wasn't about love. He said that when he was going through his own mother's things after her death, he'd found survey documents and old correspondence that told him what his second wife had once tried to do. And that even though Susan was long gone from all our lives, by then he'd never quite been able to separate Callum and Priya's branch of the family from that history, not out of blame. He was careful to say because they were children when it happened and knew nothing about it, but because he'd made a promise to his mother's memory that the house would go to whichever of his children had shown. And practice, and not just in blood, they understood what the house actually was. He said watching me spend a year restoring the water damage and the library and the old portraits, not for money, not because he asked twice, but because I kept showing up, had answered a question he'd been quietly asking himself for over a decade. I'm not choosing Nora because I love her more, his recorded voice said, and I remember exactly where I was sitting when I heard it. I'm choosing her because she's the only one of my children who ever treated this house like it was worth saving before she had any reason to think she'd get to keep it. I called Callum the next morning. I didn't lead with the recording. I led with an apology for things that were entirely mine to apologize for. And I asked him to come to the house. He didn't want to. Priya came instead, reluctant and still angry, sitting across from me in the same library where I'd found everything, arms crossed like she was bracing for another disappointment. I played her the recording first, then let her read the letters herself, in whatever order she wanted, at whatever pace she needed. I didn't say anything while she read. There wasn't anything useful I could have said. It took her a long time to speak. When she finally did, she didn't apologize either. Not right away, and I didn't expect her to, because 6 weeks of genuine grief and suspicion doesn't dissolve in one afternoon, just because new information arrives. But she said something I've held on to since. I spent 6 weeks being angry at you for something Mom did before I was even born, and you didn't even know about it either. That was the whole truth of it, really. None of us had chosen the roles we ended up in. We just inherited them, the way you inherit a house, or a name, or a debt you didn't know you owed. Callum came around slower. He read the letters 3 separate times before he said anything to me at all, and even then, what he said wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more honest than that. He said he still wished the will had been different, and that hearing the truth didn't erase 6 weeks of believing his sister had manipulated a dying man. But he stopped calling me a manipulator. He started calling me Nora again, instead of she. Some repairs happen slowly in pieces, the way you'd restore a house that's been let go for years. You don't fix the whole thing in one afternoon. You just stop the damage from spreading, and you keep showing up the next day and the day after that. I finished the restoration of Ashgrove that following autumn. The library shelves are full again. The east wing doesn't leak anymore. I kept the panel behind my grandmother's desk, but I had it rebuilt so it opens properly now instead of needing to be pried apart. A door instead of a wound is how I think of it. I put the letters and the recorder inside a proper archival box and left them exactly where she'd hidden them, because I understood, finally, what Eleanor meant by whoever restores this room. She wasn't just talking about the walls. Callum and Priya come for Sunday dinner now, most weeks. Not every week. We're not the family we were before any of this, and I don't think we ever will be. You don't rebuild something back to its original shape. Not really. You rebuild it into whatever shape it can actually hold now. But we sit at the same table, in the house our grandmother tried to protect, and our father tried to honor, and some Sundays that feels like more than enough. The first of those dinners was stiff, in a way that almost made me laugh, if any of it had been funny yet. Priya brought a bottle of wine she didn't open. Callum stood in the front hall for a full minute looking at the restored ceiling molding before he said anything to me at all, and when he finally spoke, what he said was, "You fixed the crack that used to run through the plaster rose." Like that was easier to talk about than anything else in that hallway. I told him yes, I'd fixed it, and for a moment, that was the whole conversation, and it was enough, because it was the first ordinary sentence either of us had managed to say to the other in almost 2 months. We sat at the long table that seats 12, just the three of us at one end of it, which should have felt smaller than it did. Priya asked halfway through the meal whether I'd found anything else in the walls, and I told her about the running list still taped inside the kitchen cabinet, and for the first time since the funeral. She laughed, not a big laugh, just a short one surprised out of her, and said our father used to keep the exact same kind of list taped inside the same cabinet decades earlier, back before either of them were born. Neither of us knew if that was really true or if she'd just said it to have something kind to hand across the table. It didn't matter. I took it anyway. Callum didn't say much that first dinner, but he came back the following Sunday and the one after that. And somewhere around the 4th week he started arriving early enough to help me carry the good china down from the cabinet above the pantry, the way he used to when we were teenagers and our father hosted the whole extended family every Easter. He still hasn't said the word sorry to me outright, not in so many words, and I've stopped waiting for it because I understand now that for him, showing up 4 Sundays in a row and remembering which cabinet the china lives in is its own kind of apology, just one that doesn't need to be spoken to count. I'm telling you this because I think most of us have at least one wall in our own lives with something hidden behind it. A thing someone we loved carried alone so we wouldn't have to. Sometimes you don't find out what it costs them until long after they're gone, and sometimes the only thing that clears your name isn't an argument you win. It's a truth that was there the whole time, waiting behind a panel someone built on purpose for someone who'd eventually need it. That's how it ended for me, but houses like this one hold more than they ever let on, and somewhere, someone else is about to find their own version of what I found. Subscribe if you want to be there when they do.